The credible threat of impeachment did drive Nixon from office, but the threat was based partly, remember, on Nixon himself, his words, his tapes, his evidence that did in his presidency. Now, on this Sunday night, 3 weeks into this Ukraine crisis, if you can believe it, it is also President Trump's words that have moved Congress to the brink of impeachment. Never before has a president confessed in public to a plot to press a foreign government to help him win re-election.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call?
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens.
Demanding a major investigation to take out a rival is exactly the kind of thing that can land a U.S. official in jail. And that's another way Trump's current crisis tracks the actions that did push Nixon ultimately out of office. It was actions that he took to help his re-election that undid him. A break-in, of course, at the DNC's offices at the Watergate complex, and then a cover-up about it. And that made ultimately for a damning and simple case: abusing power to get re-elected and abusing power to cover it up. Nixon's team was convicted of crimes aimed at keeping him in the White House and crimes aimed at covering up those crimes. Why do we hear so much about the cover-up being worse than the crime? Well, it is largely because the cover-up creates evidence of the original crime, plus it adds a new one. Remember, when Nixon finally revealed that smoking gun tape, it wasn't some kind of original confession of the break-in. It was evidence of Nixon abusing power to try to stop the FBI from investigating the break-in, trying to get them under control. Pressing the FBI to be loyal to the president's agenda over the obligations of law enforcement, interfering in the election. That's what pushed Nixon to resign. Impeachment and conviction on that evidence apparently seemed likely, a contrast to the House impeachment of President Clinton. Republicans insisted at the time they had evidence of a cover-up, but unlike Nixon, the underlying allegation didn't involve election interference or a campaign burglary. Clinton argued that however deeply he betrayed his oaths to family or God, he said there wasn't evidence of a public betrayal of his office.
Now this matter is between me, the two people I love most, my wife and our daughter, and our God. Nothing is more important to me personally, but it is private. And I intend to reclaim my family life for my family. It's nobody's business but ours.
Many condemned Clinton's actions, including some prominent Democrats at the time, and many argue that those kind of actions should be relevant to whether an official is promoted or confirmed or reelected, but that the Constitution's high bar for removing a president for abuse of office is something else. And the Senate vote on that wasn't close. 10 Republicans crossed the aisle to vote not guilty for Clinton on the article of impeachment about perjury regarding his conduct. That whole tally is a reminder that Trump does face very different dynamics now. Few would argue that using military aid to pressure a foreign leader to investigate your rival is somehow out of bounds or personal. Many argue it is textbook violations of the office of the presidency, and it's something that the founders warned about. Remember, James Madison talked explicitly about a president who might betray his trust to foreign powers being impeached, while another founder, Governor Morris, said impeachment would be necessary to respond to the danger of seeing the first magistrate in foreign pay. We turn now to two expert panelists to kick off this special. Presidential historian Michael Beschloss and Eleanor Clift, Washington correspondent for the Daily Beast, who also observed and covered the Clinton impeachment. Thank you both for kicking off our special. Michael, what do you see as history's lesson here?
Well, history's lesson is that the founders came up with the idea of impeachment because if you look at the Constitution, Ari, it's very vague about what a president should do and how a president should behave. Much later, as you know, Gerald Ford said that grounds for impeachment are anything that a majority of the House wants it to be. He was being a little bit cavalier, but he wasn't entirely wrong.
Eleanor?
Well, the obstruction of justice article that was filed against both President Nixon and President Clinton, there were 9 counts in the Nixon article, and there were 7 counts in the Clinton article. Robert Mueller's report listed 10 counts of obstruction of justice, and that's even before we got to Ukraine. So I think if there's any question whether impeachment is a legitimate tool to hold this president accountable, you have to look at history and you have to come away and say yes. One of the big differences between then and now is that both Nixon and Clinton had already been reelected. This president is going into his reelection. And if the predictions are that the Senate fails to convict, he would go into his reelection campaign as likely an impeached president. Now, how are Republicans, maybe soft Republicans, not his base, and independents, will they really want to reinstall a president who's been impeached? It's a terrible black mark on your legacy. Bill Clinton was a successful president, but the first paragraph of his obituary, as he has often said, will be the fact that he was impeached. He paid a big price, and the country paid a big price. So this is something the president, for all his chest beating, bring it on, he is doing everything now to try to avoid this and run away from it and run out the clock. And Congress is just as determined to hold him accountable. So we have it's whatever is better than Shakespearean. That's what this is. Well, Trumpian, maybe that's going to be a new term of art.
Yeah, well, but the Shakespearean part, Michael, would be that history is always animated by how people act, what moves them, what consumes them. Powerful people making mistakes and trying to hold on to power. What do you think is the significance in the Nixon example that it was designed for his reelection, and the Trump example, as admitted by the president, is a similar motivation?
Well, in Nixon's case, that Nixon did all this and he didn't really have to. That's the Shakespearean part, Ari, because in June of 1972, Nixon was doing this because he was worried that he might be defeated by, of all people, George McGovern, who was the Democratic, obvious to be the Democratic nominee very shortly, and was running way behind. So, Nixon was running very scared in an election campaign, which by then he didn't really need to.
And do you see parallels there in the lengths that the president admits to have gone, along with Rudy Giuliani, who's been in the news, to get dirt on Mr. Biden, who may or may not be the nominee?
Absolutely. So if Biden turns out not to be the nominee or not a formidable frontrunner, there would be that parallel for sure.
And in that parallel, and obviously no one in this panel or any of our panels tonight is prejudging what we may learn or what will happen.
Right.
But in that parallel, I do wonder, Michael, and then Eleanor, about the significance of what we always call tapes, an echo that the president and his detractors have both played with, threatening there may be tapes when there weren't. Mr. Comey famously saying to Congress under oath, Lordy, I hope there are tapes. And yet, Michael, unlike the Nixon example, some of the most scandalous and concerning material is what has been said on tape in public. Take a look.
It was largely the fact that we don't want our people, like Vice President Biden and his son, creating to the corruption already in the Ukraine. Very important. I want other countries to put up money. I think it's unfair that we put up the money. Then people called me, they said, oh, let it go, and I let it go.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens.
Michael, as our in-house historian, where does that rate on the scale of 0 to smoking gun?
Well, it raises the question, Ari, that if Nixon had said in public, let's say in June of 1972, I think this break-in the Watergate headquarters should not be investigated because it might get involved in some area of national security. It raises the question, in retrospect, maybe that is something that Nixon would have been benefited by.
Eleanor?
Well, there are two potential smoking guns out there. One is the secret server and whatever that may hold of transcripts of phone calls. And then the second one is the charges the president has spoken to other leaders, and that there is still more out there to be found. And we see it in the public polling that the number of people who think this president should be impeached and removed from office is going in one direction. I don't see that turning around and going the other way. But
if it proves to be a pattern.
Yeah, exactly. But a lot has to do with how, I mean, if the Senate fails to convict, how this president plays it, and will the public believe that he was exonerated and this was a witch hunt, or will he be taking himself and the Republican Party into one of the biggest landslides that could not only destroy his reelection, but also the Republican Party, which really doesn't seem to have anything that it really stands for besides just propping up this president. So I don't know what the outcome is. I think there's political risk for both parties. But I think the Democrats have to go forward with this. They've begun the process. I think Nancy Pelosi is reluctant to hold that House vote because she doesn't, it's not bipartisan yet. And if the polls continue that trend, there will be some defections on the Republican side. That's when you have the full House vote. And that's why the president is pushing to have it now.
And a very big difference from the Nixon time was that Nixon was not all that popular with the Republican Party in the Senate, which was a minority and didn't like him very much and had liberals in it and conservatives and was very different from the situation we have with Donald Trump right now, where, according to the polls, he's so popular within his own party.
Yes.
Fascinating parallels. Anyone watching us now would see several minutes into our special, we've discussed a lot of material, both historical and current, that is bad for the president, that looks bad for the office of the presidency and suggests problems here on this road to impeachment. Michael, I want to ask you now about something that tends to redound to the benefit of presidents, whoever they may be, and perhaps even this controversial president. And that is, when we look at history, at the end of the day, when the Senate is pressed into a vote, there seems to be something in an undertow beyond party where senators are very resistant to cast that final vote to remove the sitting president. It's never happened, and the acrimony in the Johnson case and the Tenure in Office Act and the Civil War and a presidential assassination, things were at a 10, but it didn't ultimately go down that way. And in the Clinton example, as we've just touched on, very different facts, but even apart from that, the notion that every single Republican would throw the book at him didn't hold, let alone getting close to 67. Since we're lucky to have you as part of our special, could you educate us on that history, that there's something else, even in partisan times, where it seems like the Senate, which is a very, very traditional body, doesn't even love the idea of going over that line?
Sure, and I'm probably the only human being who would say this, Ari, but it really goes back to 1868 because that was the Andrew Johnson impeachment, and conviction was foiled by the vote of one Kansas Senator, Edmund Ross, who could not bring himself to convict because he thought that if a president was convicted and thrown out of office, then from that moment forward, the presidency would be a very weak office. It would be sort of like in England that Congress could just vote no confidence every time they didn't like something a president did.
One vote shy, and your view of the history is that his concern was not defending this particular politician, but something larger.
That's what he said. And so what you have to hope always in history is that if there is ever a Senate trial, and it always has to be done with a sense of great gravity and hesitation, that the senators will, take their responsibility in a trial very seriously rather than just saying, we'll vote for our guy.
Democrats were relieved not to have to cast that vote to impeach Richard Nixon. And Senator Bennett Johnson, a Democrat from Louisiana, said he had a petition with 40,000 names on it supporting Nixon. He was not eager to take that vote against Nixon. And the other thing I failed to mention earlier, the other potential smoking gun is the president's tax returns, the Rosetta Stone that we've been after for years. And, they're likely to surface over the next weeks and months.
Fascinating. The history has so much to offer, and so do both of you, and I really appreciate being part of our Sunday night special. Eleanor, also known as Swellenor.
Thank you.
Michael, we'll call you OG as our in-house historian. I appreciate both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ari.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.